Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is Water Research Foundation's on Project 5033, the webcast. So project title is Demonstrating the Effectiveness of Flushing for Reducing the Levels of Legionella in Service Line and Plumbing. I'm Grace Jang, and a Research Program Manager at the Water Research Foundations. I will be a moderator for today's webcast. Before we dive into our webcast, I would like to get over a few housekeeping items. So if you have any questions during the presentations, please type them into the question box, and we'll conduct the Q&A sessions at the end of the presentations. If we cannot get to all your questions during the webcast, we will follow up with the answers afterward. Slide and a recording of the webcast will be available on the Foundation website. And certificates of completions will be automatically generated after the webcast. And at the end of the webcast, we'll ask you to fill out the follow-up survey. So please take a moment to share your thoughts with us so we can improve our future webcasts. So I'd like to just briefly speak about a little bit of background of the Project 5033. So this project was funded as part of the waterborne pathogen in distribution in a plumbing focus area. As you all know, the flushing has been recommended as one of a strategy to reduce Legionella growth and transmissions. However, so there was insufficient information demonstrating the effectiveness of the flushing to reduce Legionella in plumbing systems. So therefore, the Water Research Foundations funded Project 5033 to provide science-based information on flushing strategy to mitigate the risk of the Legionella occurrence in plumbing systems. So today, project teams will sharing their finding and recommendations with the audience. So if you like to access the final report, simply head over to the Water Research Foundation website and enter the project number 5033, and you will find a full project detail in the report, as well as 3 pages of fact sheets. Okay, now I will introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Cynthia Hawley, and she is a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, joining us today from the Trondheim, Norway. Her research focuses on innovative and cost-effective and energy-efficient and climate-effective methods to produce, monitors, and maintain the drinking water quality from source to tap. And additionally, her work includes assessing the risk associated with contaminants in product derived from the wastewater we use. Cynthia is the PI of the project. Our second speaker is Dr. Raymond Huzalski, and Ray is a professor in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Geoengineering at the University of Minnesota. He is a water treatment expert whose research focuses primarily on biological filtrations, including the removal of trace organic contaminants, and the water quality in drinking water distribution system, including the occurrence and the management of opportunistic pathogens. Ray is co-PI of the projects. And our third speaker is Dr. Michael Walk. And Michael is a researcher in environmental engineering in the Department of Infrastructure in SINTEF, located in Trondheim, Norway. With focus on the microbial ecology in engineered water system, and Michael's work covers from source to tap. He is passionate about finding pragmatic solutions to Legionella in building water system. And in particular, he's interested in evidence-based guideline and sustainable and operator-friendly practice that ensure the delivery of a safe drinking water. And Mike is co-PI of the projects. Okay, now I'll hand it over to Cynthia. And Cynthia, please begin.
I will actually be starting. So I'll jump in for you, Cynthia. So I'll start with some introduction to the project and some background. So Legionnaire's disease, of course, is something we're all interested in preventing. It's severe pneumonia, but Legionella can also cause other types of infection, Pontiac fever, which is a milder influenza-like infection. There's also potentially other non- or extrapulmonary infections that can be caused by Legionella. It's important to also talk about, when we talk about Legionella, risk isn't equally portioned out. So Legionella pneumophila is responsible for 90% or more of cases. It depends a little bit regionally, but it's the most commonly associated with illness, especially serogroup 1, and more so than the other serogroups. But there are, and this is always updating, but at least 65, 64 other species, and about half of these have been clinically observed. But these clinical cases account for a minority, so typically less than 10%. That's probably underreported, but I think it's fair to say that Legionella pneumophila is the greatest cause of infection. But there is ongoing debate about the focus of preventative measures as well as monitoring, focusing specifically on Legionella pneumophila, the species, versus other Legionella. And I'll just from explicitly at the beginning say that several disclaimers that we did not consider infection or exposure risk, and we do not see this as as flushing as the only solution to managing risk. So flushing should be considered in a context of a larger risk assessment for buildings, and often paired with other strategies. Also, this is not this is related to the prevention of Legionella, not for the reduction of severe or high-risk populations, for example, in a hospital or healthcare context where there may be other, like I said, other factors that should be considered in terms of reducing risk. And we assume that Legionella prevention is not species-specific. That's not necessarily the reality, and it's kind of an open discussion. But we take the position that if we can reduce Legionella species overall, that can contribute to specific risk reduction of, for example, Legionella pneumophila or other species. Yes, so a little bit about, so water is not sterile. Drinking water is not sterile, and that includes both groundwater and surface water. And whenever you have water in contact with surfaces, you have biofilm develop. Bacteria tend to prefer being attached to things. And so Legionella are quite adept at integrating into both relatively young as well as mature biofilms. And once present, they become usually a small but persistent and ubiquitous fraction of the community. And as biofilms grow, several things start to happen in terms of the ecology of the system. You can have shedding of the biofilm, which can spread new biofilm or colonization to downstream surfaces. But you can also start to attract protozoa. And so, for example, if you think of protozoa as cattle and biofilms as green pastures, protozoa come to feed. And this is usually deadly for bacteria in the biofilm, but Legionella have adapted to actually infect the protozoa and the host. And so if Legionella infect the host, they can use the host for replication, and eventually they may reproduce and be released outward, where they can, again, infect other protozoa. They can infect or colonize biofilm. But if there's the risk of exposure, and you have a person inhaling water that's contaminated with Legionella, there is a risk of infection. The main cause of infection in terms of Legionnaire's disease is that Legionella infects the macular or macrophage cell. So macrophage cells or white blood cells in the lungs are very similar, unfortunately, to protozoa and amoebas. And so Legionella Haemophila in particular is very adept at infecting this. But it's important to note that all Legionella more or less have some iteration of this. They're all parasitic in nature. And so if we talk about the factors benefiting Legionella survival and growth, general bacterial growth is a risk factor, and especially protozoa. But more broadly, the presence of carbon and nutrients that are available to support bacterial growth is also a risk factor. But we can also talk about temperature. Temperature is very important for Legionella. And so if we look at this plot on the bottom part, we look at temperatures that are relevant for Legionella activity. And Legionella are active in the 20 to 50 Celsius, or about 68 to 120 Fahrenheit, ideally around 35 to 46 Celsius. And unfortunately, if we look on the top of this plot, in our building water systems, that's usually the range of our hot water. And that's because that's a comfortable, usually a more or less comfortable temperature for bathing, washing hands. Ideally, then, you would operate the hot water system by turning up the heat to prevent Legionella and kill the Legionella. Unfortunately, though, that also increases the cost of energy and increases the risk of scalding. So it's a balancing act in hot water systems. But it's also worth noting that cold water can also, despite the name, we're calling it cold water, it's not necessarily cold. There can be thermal contamination of the hot water lines and cold water can also be relatively warm seasonally, for example, depending on the source. So going back to the factors benefiting Legionella survival and growth, another one that we can think about is also whether there's a disinfectant residual present, and especially if there isn't, or if it's lost, that is also a risk factor. Legionella are generally vulnerable to various disinfectants, chlorine, chloramine, and others. So the lack of them benefits them. These three other factors, growth rates, temperature cooling or heating up, but also loss of disinfectant residual, are all more or less time-based. So we might generalize that time is important, and especially residence time or water age is important. And so if we think about the role of flushing, it can be simply to just manage or reset the water age, but this has other consequences, beneficial consequences. For example, we can regulate the water temperature, keep the cold water cold, keep the hot water hot. We can also expel accumulated biomass and replenish residual disinfectant. So in this project, Water Research Foundation Project 5033, we had several objectives: assessing flushing for its potential as a corrective action for preventing and reducing Legionella levels in surface lines of premise water systems, using a combination of laboratory experiments as well as real-world case studies to generate novel hypothesis-driven data. We then wanted to use those data to provide evidence-based recommendations to a broad audience of potential stakeholders regarding the efficacy of flushing for Legionella prevention. So I'll hand it over to Ray.
Hi, everybody. So what I'd like to do next is provide you with our recommendations at the outset. Then we will provide you with all the basis for these recommendations, including our experimental design, our field testing, and our results. And then Mike will come back and remind you of our recommendations at the end. So we'll tell you what we're going to tell you, we'll tell you, and then we'll tell you what we told you. All right, so Mike pointed out a lot of these things already, so I'll just be brief. In terms of defining the problem and corrective action, we wouldn't be here if we didn't all believe or know that Legionella, and especially L. Haemophila, can cause severe illness. Another important point to mention is that these are not organisms that are associated with fecal contamination, unlike conventional pathogens that we normally worry about in water. These are naturally present in water and soil. And so because they're present in probably all or nearly all water supplies, including even groundwater, they can result in exposure risk in buildings if they multiply. And then next important point to mention, as Mike already pointed out, is the factors affecting Legionella growth include the presence of bioavailable carbon, which leads to enhanced overall microbial growth, including Legionella, temperatures in their wheelhouse for growth, which is ranging from 20 to 50 C, or about 70 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and then the lack of a residual disinfectant or extremely low concentrations of residual disinfectant, which can be a risk factor for enhancing growth. And then, as Mike already pointed out, flushing resets to water age, which could have other benefits, including thermal management, replenishment of residual disinfectant. So important before flushing to know the design and operation of the building water system, and more important even than the design is the as-built or as modified. So you should really know the current condition of your building water system, not just as it was designed. It's also important to understand the baseline water quality, meaning from the cold water system, the water quality in the main entering the building. And so that can be obtained by sampling right at or near the building inlet after maybe a period of flushing to evacuate the water supply or the supply line. And then also the hot water coming out of the hot water system. What's the water quality of that, the temperature? And then it's important to identify the scope of flushing. So where is water age or extended water age a problem? Is this a whole building issue, say perhaps during the COVID pandemic when some buildings like offices and campus buildings here at the universities were shut down entirely? Or is it a targeted flushing? Maybe it's a specific unused outlet or dead leg in an otherwise occupied and heavily used or used building. And our general flushing recommendations are as follows. First is to prime, what we call prime the cold and hot water systems with fresh municipal water coming from the mains, which typically would be the water of highest quality in the system. And so you would start near the inlet and flush out the service lines supplying the building, and then flush between the inlet and the hot water system if possible, and then move progressively further into the building. And as I already mentioned, it's important to note the baseline temperature and or disinfectant concentration entering the building so that you know when you've got that quote unquote fresh water exiting your tap. And then, as I mentioned, flushing near the inlet and progress further into the building. It's important to flush until the water quality resembles the baseline temperature. By baseline, we mean water entering the building, say from the mains, and the disinfectant levels in that supply, or the water exiting the hot water heater, if you're flushing hot water lines. And then we recommend flushing an additional 5 minutes after you get that water quality to where you to represent the inlet water quality. And then our general flushing recommendations, 2 of 2. First, prioritize flushing low aerosol outlets prior to high aerosol outlets. So when you're flushing, say, a toilet, important to keep the lid down to minimize any aerosolization, flushing faucets, and then moving to the showers where you can have maybe high aerosolization. And then we can move over to this decision diagram on the right. And so in Norway and other countries in Europe where residual disinfectant is not common, then you may have different issues, say, compared to many systems in the US where you have a substantial disinfectant residual. So if the cold water has a residual disinfectant present, then we recommend that you would leave water that's the most hostile to bacterial growth at the end of the flushing. So you would end, in this case, with cold water, which should have the highest residual concentration of disinfectant present. However, if you do not have residual disinfectant in the water, whether it's, say, a private well in the US or a system with really low residuals or no residuals, say in a European system perhaps, then you might want to leave hot water in the lines at the end of flushing if that water is such temperature that it's able to thermally inactivate Legionella, which what we're suggesting here is in excess of, say, 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So in that case, then you would end with hot water. And then some additional considerations to keep in mind, like how often should you flush? Well, if you have a residual disinfectant present, then that pressure of the residual disinfectant helps to keep these organisms under control for an extended period of time, say up to, we believe, on the order of a week or more. And so in that case, then you could obviously have longer periods between flushing if you're doing repeat flushing, or that would mean that you could flush up to a week before the building's reoccupied, and you should still be in a good place when the building's reoccupied. However, in the absence of a residual disinfectant, that time period that you have that the flushing is effective or beneficial is much shorter. We believe up to 3 days. So there you would want to wait to flush if you have no residual disinfectant to right before you're going to reoccupy that space or that building. And then when should you flush? Again, obviously before the water users could be exposed and the timelines I already mentioned. And then ideally outside of normal or peak hours to minimize hazard or exposure to occupants of the building. So next I'll turn it over to Mike to talk about methods.
Yes, thanks, Ray. So the main feature of our research project research was using a pilot scale premise plumbing system that we constructed in our laboratories here in Trondheim, Norway. So this is based in Norway, receives municipal tap water from the Norwegian municipality. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in terms of water quality in a few slides. But to talk about the pilot, if you start on the right-hand side, the building, the inlet to the pilot was basically just the tap into the building cold water supply. And we could either use this directly to supply the pilot with cold water supply, or we could divert it into a tank where we mixed it with a chloramine stock solution. So we could chloraminate the water and then feed that into the rig. There were 2 rigs in parallel. And so what's shown here is only 1 rig, and there's a second right behind it, basically a mirror image, and we could operate these independently from one another. They both have their own hot water supply. They both have 3 shower units. And so the cold water comes in, some of the cold water branches and supplies the cold water to these 3 shower outlets. And then the cold water also diverts to the hot water heater. There's about a little less than 300-liter tank using electricity to heat it. It's very common in Norway to use thermostatic mixing. And since residual disinfectant is not common in Norway, a main driver or a main strategy to prevent Legionella in buildings is to heat the water to at least 70 degrees, which is really high. But it has several benefits in that it's usually not delivered at 70. In this case, we actually turned it up to 85. And the reason for that was because with thermostat mixing, you can increase the capacity of hot water so that we could have enough hot water to supply for our flushing needs. And so even though it's less than 300 liters in the tank, with thermostat mixing, we could deliver upwards of 500 liters for flushing. Also, the thermostat mixing valve gave us precise control over the temperatures being delivered. And we were not so interested in what was happening in the hot water heater, so we wanted as minimal growth as possible. We wanted to see what was happening in the pipes themselves. And so it was important that we get the right temperatures delivered to the pipes. And so we looked at several different variables. And the first was, of course, flushing as an intervention, and more specifically, the flow rate. So for flushing, we did 5 minutes max flow. And I'll talk a little bit about this more in a couple slides. But we contrasted this versus just regular use of an outlet. What happens if you just use a shower? What does that mean for the water age? What does that mean for the biofilm versus if you actually intentionally flush? We also looked at residual disinfectant. And as I mentioned, there's no residual disinfectant in this system versus chloramine. And I'll come back to this again, how we produced this and why we chose chloramine. But those were the 2 disinfectant parameters or variables we looked at. We also looked at pipe material, copper versus PEX, PEX type A, the aqua line from Uponor. And the rig themselves were primarily made out of copper. We used solderless copper, connections. So all the connections were compression based, so there's no solder. And in the distal branches, so it's about 1 meter of pipe, both the hot and cold, just above the shower outlets. This was possible to disconnect and remove and access, so we could sample biofilm inside of the pipes. Finally, as I mentioned, we were interested in temperature, so we chose 49 or about 120 Fahrenheit. This is a very common temperature in the US, as energy savings benefits as well as lower risk of scalding. But you might also be interested in a higher temperature to prevent Legionella, so 60 degrees Celsius or about 140 Fahrenheit. And so here's a picture of the rig. On the right, it's a little bit difficult to see, but you have 3 showers, a water tank, and behind it you can kind of see the other rig, which is in parallel. So they're literally mirror images of one another. On the left-hand side, there's a garbage can that we basically used as our mix tank. So we could feed chloramine into that, mix it, and then deliver it via pump into the system. So we operated this pilot for approximately a year, just a little over a year. And during that period, we operated 4 experimental phases. And so what these represent are different combinations of the variables. So we had the copper pipe, the PEX pipe. We had the first 2 phases without disinfectant, the phases 3 and 4 with chloramine, and then switching from 60 to 49 and back to 60 again, with some time in between these phases to allow the system to adapt to the new conditions. Within these, we also had flushing events. So each phase had 3 flushing events. And I'll talk a little bit more what a flushing event is in a few slides. But going back to the variables, I just wanted to quickly touch base again on what these mean. So temperature set, so starting from the bottom, temperature set point. This is more or less what a thermostat mixing valve looks like. So there's fairly precise control of the water in from both cold and hot, and then you can set it to deliver a specific temperature out. And so during flushing, we measured hot water quite precisely to where we measured it. I should mention that the thermostat mixing valve we used was not the commercially installed or the factory installed one. We had to install a more fine or more precise one to get the temperature as precise as we wanted it. We also, so then moving on to the pipe material, the pipe materials where we sampled from were 5/8 inch. And you can see that the internal diameter was a little bit different owing to the slightly thicker pipe wall of the PEX. As for the water entering the system, if you look at the bottom, the water treatment process for this water supply is primarily lake water, so it's surface water coming from about a depth of 50 meters. And the water's quite soft. It's basically rainwater that collects in the mountains of Norway. And so they have to harden it. And so they pass it through marble to add minerals and increase the hardness. And then it's hit with about 0.1 milligrams per liter of free chlorine and then UV. And it's distributed with negligible free chlorine. And so the temperature year round in the distribution network is typically about 10 Celsius, pH of 8, hardness after hardening is 54, so it's quite soft water. The total organic carbon, or TOC, was about 2.7 milligrams per liter, and the assimilable organic carbon was about 100 micrograms per liter, which is more than enough to support bacterial growth under favorable conditions. And like I said, in the distribution network, it's usually negligible concentrations of free chlorine. So we were interested in this context of no residual. That's very relevant for Norway as well as other European countries and maybe other countries around the world. But it's also relevant for countries like the US where you have groundwater systems that don't receive any disinfectant. But also even in systems where there is a disinfectant, it's quite possible, if not likely, that there are points in the system where you lose your disinfectant before it ever comes to a building. So no residual was kind of one extreme that we were interested in. The other extreme we wanted was how could we best fight Legionella with a disinfectant? And chloramine is what we decided. It's a relatively common municipal disinfectant in the US and potentially more stable than free chlorine. That's often why it's used. It's a little bit less reactive. So you usually have to use a little bit higher concentration, but it in theory lasts longer. And it's better at, there's a growing body of evidence in the literature, the scientific literature, that is better at penetrating biofilm than free chlorine. Free chlorine is very reactive, and so it tends to react at the surface of the biofilm, but it isn't able to get down deep into the biofilm. And the target dose that we chose was 1 milligram per liter. As for flushing, of course, it can reset the water age, but we were also interested in other benefits of flushing. Is the shear stress induced if you try to maximize the flow? Does that actually harm the biofilm and remove biofilm from the pipes? And can that synergize with other strategies like thermal or chemical strategies? from a practical standpoint, we're also interested in, should operators put in the extra effort to maximize flow rate? Now, they can't necessarily just magically improve the flow rates. They're somewhat limited by the pressure into the building. But you can, for example, remove aerators or other flow obstructing devices to try to maximize. And as we did, you can flush fully on the cold or fully on the hot. So you're not getting a combination of the two, which would have less flow. Yeah, so that's my little animation of shearing off the biofilm. So operating the shower outlets, we had flushing, which I mentioned is maximized flow. We removed the shower hose when we did it. It was for 5 minutes, full cold or for full hot. Turbulent flow, I won't go through all the flow rates, but they're there for you. And then for shower, we want to represent a conventional usage. So we actually used a Water Research Foundation report to the typical time and flow rate of shower, 8 minutes, 7.2 liters per minute, or almost 2 gallons per minute, and 40 degrees Celsius, so a blend of hot and cold. And so going back to the operation, I mentioned these flushing events. And so what this looked like, they were typically 2 weeks or 14 days in length. And so what would happen is we'd start with stagnant water that had been sitting and had accumulated a long water age. And then we would sample the water. We would run either in one of the lines, we'd flush it. Second one, we'd operate a shower. And then the third one, we'd do nothing. And then we would sample the water again. And then we'd sample the biofilm from the pipes. And then we'd operate the flushed and shower line with daily showers for a little less than a week. And then afterwards, we just let the water sit. The final line was more of a control, so we could have what the biofilm looked like pre-flush and pre-shower. And this was which outlet did what was shuffled in between lines. So there wasn't, we tried to prevent a bias or carryover effect of the operation of the outlets between phases. So the water samples, we collected either 100 or up to a liter of water. The water was filtered to collect the biomass. Some of it, the unfiltered water, was also used for additional analyses, which I'll come back to. We also collected biofilm samples, and our PhD student, Truka, who I should mention did most of this work, came up with a method to use a sponge with a wire wrapped around it, then plug it into a power drill, and then stick the sponge into the pipe, run it clockwise for 30 seconds one way, run it counterclockwise for 30 seconds, and then we used a combination of sonication and elution with a liquid to resuspend the cells, and then we extract the DNA from those. And so our sample analysis, we used multiple methods, different types of methods. Quantitative PCR, we looked at total bacteria using 16S rRNA genes. We also looked at the total number of Legionella species, so the genus level. We also looked at Legionella pneumophila specifically, and Vermamoeba vermiformis, which is a common amoeba host of Legionella. We also used flow cytometry to look at total cell count and intact cell count, as well as cultivation methods. We used IDEX Legionalert. We never detected Legionella pneumophila, and so we ended up stopping this using the Legionalert system. We also used heterotrophic plate counts to measure the general biomass, and we did this for 2 of the phases before stopping. We generally found that heterotrophic plate count underestimated biomass compared to the 2 culture-independent methods, flow cytometry and PCR. And as you can see on the right, the PCR and flow cytometry gave really consistent results. And so in this work, in this presentation, we'll just be presenting the PCR, but the full report includes some of the other results. So then I will pass it over to Cynthia.
Thank you, Mike. So I will start presenting the result we gathered during this project, and we are going to start with the flushing without a residual disinfectant. In addition to the report, WRF 5033, the result of the flushing experiment without chlorine residual have been published in Frontier in Water. those results, many of the results are presented in the form of a heat map we show now. I want to point out to attract your attention to the scale unit. We are using a color scale that go from high concentration in the blue color to lower concentration in the yellow colors. In addition to the scale, the color scale, you see numbers into those boxes, and those are the log. It's a log scale, log copy per liter, and the number represent 8 log represent, for example, 6 log represents 6 million copy per liter. In this first heat map, we are looking at the suspended total bacteria at different water age without residual. And we see the result in cold and hot water supply, of flush and non-flush shower, and also for the 2 pilot rig, the one with the copper and the PICS pipe. At the bottom of the heat map, we see the elapsed time that is relative to the flushing event within each of the cycles, and we see the active and low water demand. While the water age is the duration spent stagnant in the pilot pipe. So if we focus for cycle 1, for example, on if we focus on the active and low water demand, we see that the total bacteria, the gene target concentration, were lower during the active water demand period compared to the low water demand period. In a couple of slides, we are going to look in detail what happened to total bacteria when the water age increased in the pilot. But for now, we're going to focus our attention on the big picture. So if we look at the hot water versus the cold water, and immediately after a shower, the total bacterial concentration in the hot water supply was always lower than for cold water supply. In addition, we see that the total bacterial concentration at time 0 was lower at 60 degrees compared to 49 degrees. If we look what happened after 24 hours of stagnation, we observe that total bacterial concentration in both hot and cold water lines significantly increased compared to the time 0. If we are interested to look at what happened between the flush and the non-flush line, during phase 1, for both cold and hot water, the total bacterial concentration was significantly lower in the flush pipe compared to the non-flush pipe. But that was not observed in the phase 2. For total bacteria in the hot and cold water were similar. We will see in the next section results about Vermamoeba vermiformis, but it's interesting to note at this point that the amoeba were never detected immediately after a shower or flush in this experiment conducted without residual disinfectant. But the amoeba were frequently detected in the water sample after a shower. So after 24 hours of stagnation during the active water demand, it was frequently detected. Now we are looking at the heat map for Legionella species. And what we notice, we have a different scale color in that case. High concentration are in red and low concentration are in a green color. And we see that flushing reduce accumulated Legionella species concentration by about 1.7 log copies, or 97%. The Legionella species concentration did not significantly increase after a short period of stagnation of 24 hours in both hot and cold water. But the concentration of Legionella at the start of the low water demand period were lower in the sample collected in the hot water line compared to the cold water line. If we focus on the short-term effect or short-term benefit of flushing on Legionella, this graph here shows that Legionella concentration decrease after a flushing event. So if we compare pre-flush to post-flush. And in this graph, we can see the effect of pipe material where copper and PEX, the Legionella concentration of in copper and PEX pipe were similar. And we can also start to observe the trend where after a flush, the Legionella concentration start to increase in both cold and hot water. In this slide, we see the concentration of total bacteria and also Legionella. The total bacteria are in solid line and Legionella are in the broken line during the low water demand period. And without chlorine residual, total bacterial concentration increased to reach a stationary phase between 8.6, 8.9 log copy per liter with approximately 10 days of stagnation. The concentrations tend to stabilize or even decrease for the remainder of the stagnation period. However, for Legionella, the picture is quite different. Legionella species require more time than total bacterial community to reach the stationary phase. In fact, during this study, we never plateau in Legionella concentration to indicate a stationary phase. The growth model that we use estimate a carrying capacity for Legionella species between 5.5 to 7.4 log copy per liter. So the key findings for this section are that immediate reduction of total bacteria and Legionella species in the water from the flushing or typical shower were similar, and they range between 90 and 99%. The higher flow rate during the flushing may accelerate the turnover of the whole water, which reduce the time required to flush, but do not influence the volume of water being flushed. The flushing is effective to reset bacterial level with significant reduction observed within approximately 3 days after flushing. However, this short-term effect may not be sufficient for controlling Legionella growth, as Legionella population dynamic can be influenced by several other factors. And finally, in bulk water, there's insufficient evidence to support a difference in log reduction between the pipe material. I will now hand it over to Michael again.
Yes, thanks, Cynthia. So Cynthia gave a good overview of the results in terms of no residual, which is kind of the default state for Norway. But as mentioned earlier, we also looked at the case of residual chloramine. So to get into that a little bit more, we can talk about how we chloraminated the system. So we came up with a stock chloramine using the EPA method of about 1,000 parts per million. We produced that using a 4:1 by mass ratio of free chlorine and ammonia. And then this was dosed into the mixed tank, where it was delivered at a final dose of about 0.9 milligrams per liter. Our target was 1 milligram per liter. These were really low CT values, so cold is 3.6 to 3.6 milligram minutes per liter. Hot was 6.4 milligram minutes per liter. And what we can see is that on the right-hand side, if you look at pilot experiments, basically the blue is the cold water, the dark blue. Red is hot water, and basically it plunges. The concentration is gone within a number of hours. And that's much faster than if you look at it at the concentrations in bottles. This is not unexpected. This has been observed in other systems, and Ray will talk about this a little bit more during the field study discussion. But basically, the chloramine doesn't stay very long in buildings, and that might be for several reasons. One could be, for example, reacting with copper. So going back to these heat maps, I won't spend too much time with these, but what I find very appealing about looking at these is the visual contrast. So this was already presented to you by Cynthia. So this is without a residual. And if we look at it with a residual, it doesn't look actually that different, interestingly enough. So I'll just go back again, forward, back, forward. And so one of the interesting things actually is that during a higher water age, the concentration was a little bit higher. And it's quite possible that we were actually stimulating bacterial growth in the water phase when we added chloramine, because the chloramine decays into ammonia, or a source of nitrogen. So we could be increasing the nitrogen in the water. These are relatively low nitrogen waters. We might also be producing more accessible organic carbon by the chloramine reacting with natural organic matter. But we don't really have enough information, and it isn't a huge increase, but it's just like a half a log increase or less. So if we look at what this means in terms of no residual, as Cynthia mentioned, you saw a drop in total bacteria immediately after flushing, and it was back up to its basically stationary phase concentrations, maximum concentration within 2 to 3 days, and it stayed pretty consistent beyond 2 to 3 days. And interestingly enough, the same thing was observed with chloramine, which is a little bit unexpected, how fast they were able to respond to the addition of chloramine. There wasn't a huge impact of flushing versus not flushing, so it seemed that just turning the water over had the same effect, but also pipe material wasn't quite a significant variable. Looking at Legionella, however, so again, this is the heat map with no residual. Chloramine has a much larger impact. So I'll go forward and then backwards. So no residual, residual. And so in this case, yellow to green is lower and red and darker is higher. So we see that with chloramine, across the board, Legionella levels were reduced. And so what that means from a Legionella standpoint, unlike no residual, where you had this immediate loss of biomass when you turned the water over, and then it crept back up in the 2 to 3 to 6 days afterward. With chloramine, it was low before, it was low after, and it stayed low for the most part. 6+ days, that's kind of lumping together some data, but we saw, I think, around 14 days and longer. Then we started to see in some places Legionella come back. And so that's a quite stark difference in contrast to the total bacteria. Looking at the amoebas, they were kind of hit or miss, so it's difficult to draw too many conclusions. But the main one is that they typically were not in fresh water coming into the system, but they were often detected once you had water age. So again, looking at growth versus water age. So in these plots, again, log scale on the y-axis, water age on the bottom. The top lines, the solid lines with white dots, is total bacteria, whereas the dashed lines with non-white dots or diamonds are Legionella. And so we see pretty much the same behavior between copper and PEX. And the biggest difference is, this similarity is between is that total bacteria responds, grows in about the same amount of time, regardless of whether the chloramine was added or not. But we see a stronger result with the addition of chloramine versus Legionella in terms of it stays pretty low. Interestingly enough, we saw in PEX that it tended to increase, where we didn't see that same level of increase in copper, but we didn't have enough data points to really, at that really extended 20+ day mark, to draw any statistical significance. But certainly in the short term, there wasn't any noticeable effect between copper and PEX. So the key findings, that there's a limited effect of chloramine versus total bacteria. It may even be stimulated, but time is also a variable in terms of we ran the experiments over the course of a year. And so maybe there's other things happening, seasonal differences, for example. Concentration of Legionella was stable post-chlorination, so it seemed to damage or induce a lag phase. Viramoeba were present at low levels with higher water age, which is consistent with there being higher biomass at higher water age. And so that gives them something to respond to and eat. But it also makes the beneficial mechanism flushing a little bit different depending on the context. So when there's no residual, basically bacterial growth is, including Legionella growth, is not under control. And so flushing is important to expel this accumulated biomass. Whereas with chloramine, Legionella growth was suppressed. And so flushing was necessary to keep that suppression active. So resetting the disinfectant levels. And it didn't suppress the total bacteria. So in that case, it also helps expel bacteria. And another interesting trend or theme throughout this is that Legionella presence and growth was not limited to the hot water. So a lot of focus, especially in Norway, is focused on the hot water. But it's the cold water too. And so they come in with the cold water and there's activity in the cold water. Looking at the biofilm, we didn't do too much in terms of interpretation. It's a little bit difficult, especially with Legionella, because they're often below the quantification limit. There are some key things to note. So on the left-hand side is total bacteria levels. We generally saw lower biofilm levels with chloramine than with no residual, but there are biofilm in both cases. And there was biofilm in both hot and cold water, which was also an interesting. So just because it's super hot, 60 plus degrees, does not mean that it is free of biofilm. And in terms of Legionella, though, we saw actually more biofilm in the cold water than in the hot water. Across, we had to throw out the data from phase 1 because we changed the biofilm method. But for phases 2, 3, and 4 was the same method. So, also of note is that chloramine really seemed to help suppress Legionella levels in the biofilm. So the key findings here was that there was no clear or at least consistent effect of pirate material with regard to biofilm biomass. There were similar total bacteria between hot water and cold water, but less Legionella in hot water versus cold water, which is somewhat at odds with what we usually think of as hot water being the problem. And also, chloramine helps reduce biofilm Legionella versus when there isn't any chloramine. But it's important to note that even if you removed all the biofilm, if Legionella is still coming in with the water, we clearly saw growth in the water phase. So just removing the biofilm doesn't stop the problem of Legionella because it will continue to come in. So then I will turn it over to Ray to talk about our field studies.
Thanks, Mike. So I'd like to just spend a few minutes talking about a field study that we did in Minnesota, in the United States. And so our sampling sites included 5 University of Minnesota buildings. 4 were on the Minneapolis campus of the university. We labeled these A, B, C, and D. And it's important to note that this is a surface water supply. So it's from Minneapolis Water Treatment Distribution Services. It's from the Mississippi River, softened, filtered, and then finished with chloramines. Typical concentrations that we see in the distribution system range from about 3 to upwards of 3.5 milligrams per liter of Cl2. And then we did sample a building on the St. Paul campus, which is supplied by a different water system. It's St. Paul Regional Water Services. The water also originates from the river. It is also treated similarly with softening, filtration, and then it's also finished with chloramines. Again, similar concentration range of around 3+ milligrams per liter SCl2. We also sampled a suburban high school, which is a deep groundwater, which is disinfected with free chlorine, so residual less than 1 milligram per liter in the network. And then we also sampled 3 buildings at a youth camp about an hour from the cities. And each building was supplied by its own groundwater well. And none of these wells, none of this water was disinfected. So it's basically almost like sampling private wells. In terms of our approach, so whenever we went to a building, we would start by first looking at the water meter and recording the water meter reading so that we could get a handle on water usage in the building. And all these buildings during this period we were sampling, which was during the COVID-19 pandemic in summer of 2020. So we documented low or no water use in these buildings. And then we would flush at the building inlet, so right near the water meter, to make sure that we were getting water that was of consistent quality, representative of what we knew the water main, the concentrations of chlorine, say, and temperatures in the water mains should be. And then we would move up to the shower rooms and start flushing and sampling the showers. We would remove the shower head, the flow restricting device, and we would then disinfect, as in photo 3, the shower neck using a flame torch. Then we would turn the water on and we would collect the first liter and a half, representing the stagnant water that had been sitting for several weeks in these pipes. And then we would continue to let the water flow, and we would sample periodically up to 45 minutes of flushing. We would turn the water off, we would cap the shower neck, and then we would come back a few days later, sample again, and then 6 to 7 days later and sample another time with no flushing in between. So we were basically looking at how water quality changes after a flushing event if the water was again left to stagnate. The water was collected in these Whirlpack bags, as Mike showed earlier, and then on site, we always measured temperature, pH, and total and/or free chlorine, depending on whether it was a chloraminated system or a free chlorine system. In terms of the flushing, the temperature of the water during flushing, so you have temperature on the y-axis and flushing time on the x-axis. And it just shows the different buildings, A, B, C, D, and E. And then we sometimes sampled more than one shower room, like the men's room and the women's room. So we call them primary and secondary. And as you would expect, when we're sampling with cold water, so we would turn fully cold and sample cold water and flush with cold water. And then we would also sample or flush and sample during flushing with hot water. So in the cold water, the water sitting in the pipes was representative of the room temperature, which ranged from 20 to 30 degrees Celsius. Some of these buildings were not being actively air conditioned during the pandemic closure. So the water temperature was in fact up to 30 degrees Celsius. And then it got colder as we flushed. In the hot water, as you would expect, the water would typically get hot as we flushed and ended up between 40 and 45-ish degrees Celsius. However, in a couple of instances, like in one case, the hot water temperature had been turned, or hot water heaters had been turned off. And so the water actually got colder as we flushed. And we asked them to turn the hot water heaters on, and then we got a hot water flush. And in one case, the blue line, it was a broken water mixer. So we actually we didn't get hot water. So we ended up going to a different shower in that space. And so then the chlorine concentration, as shown in this graph, so total chlorine milligrams per liter of Cl2 versus flushing time on the x-axis. And in most cases, we had little or no chlorine detected at that first draw sample of the stagnant water. However, within about 6 minutes of flushing, we were typically close to or at the building inlet concentrations in terms of total chlorine. And you can see that's around 3 milligrams per liter for most of these facilities. And typically within 10 or 12 minutes, we were fully at the building inlet concentration. In the hot water, we never obtained the inlet chlorine concentration of the cold water supply. So normally the chlorine concentrations in the hot water was maybe 10% to maybe 70 or 80% of the building inlet concentration in the cold water. And as Mike already pointed out, when we turned the flushing off after about 45 minutes, and we came back and sampled, say 1 to 2 days later, or again 5, 6, 7 days later, what we found is that usually within a couple of days, the chlorine concentration was substantially suppressed, maybe half or less of what we started with, which was around 3 milligrams per liter in most cases. And then within 5 or 6 days, the chloramine concentration was basically non-detect. And if we did the same thing in a glass bottle, we saw very little decay. So obviously there's more things in the pipes to react with, including biofilm, including copper, what have you. In terms of total bacteria, again, this is a heat map where lighter color, it means less concentration, and darker green, like 8 means 100 million copies per liter. 3 is 1,000 copies per liter on the low end of our scale. And so you can see the inlet concentrations were often non-detect or around 3 to 4 log copies, maybe up to 5. And so 5 log copies per liter is about 100,000. And then the stagnant water sample, which is the pre-flush sample, had the highest concentrations we observed in any of our samples. That was water that ages on the order of several weeks or more. And then within a few minutes of flushing, we were typically at the inlet concentration or non-detect. But then you notice in the follow-up samples, which are the panels on the far right, the 2 rows on the far right, or columns on the far right, we started to rebound within 2 to 4 days. And within 6 to 7 days, we were typically quite close to, maybe not entirely all back to the pre-flush concentration. So again, the biomass in the system quickly rebounds. In terms of Legionella, and I should also mention that the St. Paul system was system E, and the pre-flush and the inlet concentration and during flushing, we were constantly measuring total biomass. And we think that was because of some elevated water age due to a water storage tower on the St. Paul campus that was not being heavily used. The campus builder wasn't being heavily used because of the shutdown. We never detected Legionella pneumophila via either Legionella or PCR. So it's important to point that out. And then if we look at Legionella species, we saw much the same thing in terms of total biomass, where the inlet concentrations were typically below or non-detect, especially the Minneapolis buildings. The pre-flush concentrations were the highest we observed. When we flush, the concentrations typically diminish to non-detect. And then during some follow-up sampling, we start to see some rebound, although we didn't quite rebound fully within a week. So we started to see some detections, but we didn't quite get back to where we started. The St. Paul building was a bit of an oddball again. We think that was because elevated water ages from a water storage tower on that campus. These data are published in a paper in Environmental Science Technology if you would like to read more about this study. So some take-home messages. Chloramine appears to limit colonization of premise plumbing systems by L. pneumophila, decreasing the likelihood of problems from building closures and elevated stagnation on the order of weeks. Other concerning populations were observed, including Legionella species and MAC, but in all cases, we did not observe any concentrations that would be considered serious health risk. We did quantitative microbial risk assessment. I didn't get a chance to show you the groundwater data in the interest of time. It's also important to mention that flushing with chlorinated water does improve biological water quality substantially, but only temporarily, so it's important to keep that in mind. And then the groundwater systems were less likely to have opportunists, and flushing seemed to have little or no impact actually on biological water quality in the absence of disinfection. And then I'll move it on to Cynthia, who will talk about the field study in Norway, and we're almost done.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. So in collaboration with the municipality of Trondheim, we conducted a field study in a primary school, and it was selected because its accessibility for sample collection and also its extended monitoring. The sampling protocol was implemented in April 2022, following a temporary closure of the school for approximately 11 days. The building received its drinking water from the same source as the pilot system described by Mike earlier on. At the school, the thermostat of the hot water heater was set at 70 degrees, but the delivered water was at 50 degrees to avoid scalding in the facility. 3 shower outlets were selected on the main floor of the building. One outlet was randomly selected in the men and women locker room, employee locker room, and the third outlet was located in an unused washroom at the end of the hall. And here we see the water quality parameter, where the hot water never quite reached the target temperature of 50 degrees Celsius, but rather 45 degrees. And the cold water after a post-flush was approximately 8 degrees Celsius. No chlorine residual was monitored in the water at any time, and the pH varied between 7.5 and 8.2. During this study, the total bacteria were detected in stagnant pre-flush sample at concentration between 5.4 and 7.4 log copy per liter in both hot and cold water. So the flushing of the cold and the hot water line did not reduce the total bacterial concentration. And also, the Legionella species were typically below the limit of quantification for this flushing event. In addition to the total bacteria and Legionella, we look at the cell concentration using online flow cytometry, and we measure total cell count and intact cell count continuously for an extended period of time. And those two plots suggest that the cell count increase is time dependent, and it's also linked to water usage during the day. We can see a spike in both total cell count and intact cell count at the time of usage in the morning, Monday morning, Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning, and so on. So I will pass it over to Ray, to Mike, for the final flushing recommendation.
Yeah, and Ray did a nice job at the start of the presentation summarizing these, so I'll just re-summarize them very briefly. Flushing resets the water age, and what we saw that the water age was the main driver. So it wasn't how fast the water was flowing or anything. It's just the benefit was just from resetting it. It's good to understand your system as is and how you operate it. Understand the baseline water temperature and residual disinfectant if there is a disinfectant residual. And we identified these two parameters as the most practical and useful in terms of indicating when the water, in fact, has been turned over. And identify your scope. Whole building, or are you doing targeted? Where's the problem with water age? So the general recommendations: prime your cold and hot water system with fresh municipal water. So start with the service line, move toward the near the hot water system, and then flush different lengths of pipe farther and farther out from the different outlets as you get farther from the inlet. Consider prioritizing faucets and toilets before showers, just to reduce the amount of potential aerosols and contaminated water that's being produced as air, or being exposed or creating aerosols. And then leave the outlet with water most hostile to bacterial growth. Based on what we saw in terms of regrowth or new growth of cells, if the residual disinfectant is present, we found about a week was good. If no residual disinfectant was present, you have less time, so about 3 days. When should I flush? Before water users could be exposed and outside normal peak hours. So I'll just quickly acknowledge some people. So I wanted to acknowledge the Water Research Foundation, and especially Grace, who is our project lead from the Research Foundation. From the project team, I wanted to specifically mention Chiruka Migoda. He has now successfully defended his PhD, which was based on this work, and he did most of the field the pilot work. Also recognize just briefly the PAC, the Project Advisor Committee, and the team that gave us really great feedback, as well as our other contributors, students and others from Folkehouse Institute and Trondheim Kommune, who also contributed. So then I will pass it, I think, to Grace.
Okay. Well, thank you to all our speakers today for the excellent presentations. Again, to the audience, the final report is available on the foundation website, and please go to the foundation website and WRFO website and type in the 5033, and then you can download and access the final report. So we will now begin the Q&A sessions. Again, if you have any questions, please type them into the question box, and then we'll address as many as possible. Okay, let's get started with the first questions. So this question's for Mike. So the question is, although the flushing resets the water age, you could potentially cause slugging of biofilms already in the distribution system. So how would you recommend you manage it for that?
Yeah, and so that's where our recommendation for starting at the service line and then making sure that both the cold water system and the hot water system have fresh water from the network, and then progressively moving outward. The idea is if you have contamination in your network, if you started at the far end of the building, you would have to pull a lot of water through the building to get to the end point. And if any of that water is contaminated, or if there's biofilm that's contaminated, you're going to then spread that contamination throughout the building. So to avoid that, we recommend starting where the water comes in, get it fresh, and then slowly and incrementally moving outward so that you expel any contamination that's there, get it out of the system, and then move outward. And so you're continually pulling fresher water further into the system.
Thank you. And Ray and Cynthia, is there anything you would like to add? Okay. All right, let's move on to the next questions. I think this question's for Cynthia. So that you have a pilot study and then have 4 different phases. So what was the conditions, adaptations, the time period for each phase?
Yes. Well, first of all, I would like to mention that before we started to operate the pilot, we run water through the brand new copper pipe for a period of about 3 months, just over 3 months, to flush out. We monitor copper concentration and make sure we were at a stable and desired concentration. And then we had a minimum of 2 weeks between the phases, and often it was much longer than that due to operational issues, vacations, and so on. So the transition period varied, but the minimum period between the phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 were 2 weeks.
Anyone would like to add, or we're good? Okay. We're gonna move on to the next question. Thank you, Cynthia. So the next question, this question's for Ray. So Ray, while the chloramines penetrate biofilms, the questions is keep moving. Okay, so while chloramines penetrate the biofilms better than free chlorine, does not the ammonia also tend to support the biofilm formations?
Yeah, that is an issue with chloramine decay in that it does release ammonia, which can be either a nutrient for heterotrophs or it could also serve as a energy source for autotrophic populations, ammonia oxidizing bacteria and archaea. So there is always potential when you have chloramine decay that you are releasing ammonia, which again can be an electron donor or a nutrient. And Mike did imply that we actually did see some very, very slight maybe increases at extended water ages in these chloraminated systems, which again, these are low nutrient waters in Norway, so it may have been due to stimulation as ammonia as a nutrient. However, that said, I firmly believe that chloramine is an excellent disinfectant for helping to control Legionella in water systems. So even though there is potential for chloramine decay to release nutrients into the water supply, I think if you maintain chloramine residuals at an effective level, meaning on the order of a ppm or more, if you have high pH, which minimizes chloramine decay, I think that it's a really, really effective disinfectant, has been shown in studies, for example, in San Francisco and other places, but done by other researchers. But also free chlorine, if the residual is effectively maintained, I think free chlorine is also quite effective. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Great. So Cynthia and Mike, would you like to add? Is there anything you would like to add? No. Okay. Well, since we're talking about the chloramine, so there is another question about the chloramine solutions. So I'm going to ask that questions. So can you speak of the shelf life of the chloramine solutions used in the experiment? Anyone would like to take these questions?
Yeah, I can answer this. We made a stock solution of chloramine, and the shelf life was about 1 week. And every day we used the chloramine solution. We tested the concentration and adjusted the dosage according to the concentration of the stock solution to get as close of the 1 milligram per liter, the desired concentration.
Well, thank you. Next question. This question's for Mike. So you explore the idea of maximizing flow. Are you anticipating this would occur in full time? So part of the reasons low flow fixtures can be put in are due to the desire to reduce water use to meet water demand challenges. How would this flow recommendations take those challenges into the considerations?
Yeah, so what we found generally was that the most visible effect of flushing was that you reset whatever the water quality was, you set it to what it is from the municipal network. And so the main goal, in our opinion, is to reset the water age. And so in that case, it's somewhat flow independent. And so that means that, and just to add to that, that means that we more or less feel that flushing is done once you see fresh water in your line. So if you know what the baseline water quality is of your hot and cold water, and you see that at your endpoint where you've done your flushing, then you're basically done. If you go another 5 minutes, we think that's done. And so whether it's low flow or high flow or maximum flow, only affects how long it takes for that plug of water to get expelled from the system. So of course you can maximize the flow. And I should mention that there might be other benefits to maximizing flow that we did not look at, like for example, sediment expulsion, if you have sediment buildup in your system. But just from the terms of getting water out in the context of what we investigated in this experiment, it doesn't really matter if it's fast or slow. Of course, if it's a lower flow rate, you have to wait longer for all the water to get out. And we actually saw that in larger buildings, it does sometimes take much longer to wait for all that water to come out.
Excellent. Well, thank you. The next questions, maybe this question's for Ray. So Ray, you present your U.S. case study. So did you compare the free chlorine to the chloramine for U.S. field study?
Yeah, that was, I would say, a limitation of our study in that the systems that we predominantly sampled, so we did 5 buildings, they were all chloraminated systems. We only had one system that was a free chlorine system. That was this groundwater system in suburban Minnesota, or suburban Twin Cities area. And so we were limited in terms of free chlorine systems in that study. And those data did appear in a separate paper where we compared the groundwater systems, both the wells that were not disinfected, a free chlorine municipal system, and then we also compared it to these chloraminated systems. So we did have one system that we did sample that had free chlorine. And it turned out that that system was, well, we didn't detect Legionella pneumophila, and I believe we had extremely low, if negligible, levels of Legionella species in that system as well. I'd be happy to provide the reference if someone's interested, they can email me.
Awesome, thank you. So next questions for Cynthia. So the question is, did your teams do any analysis of other species, non-pneumophila, of Legionella that were present?
We look at the gene marker, the MIP for Legionella pneumophila, and we look for the WISM gene marker, but we did not look for other species of Legionella.
Well, thank you. And in this question for Mike, so would hot water recirculation group added to the system have a different outcomes in terms of the biofilms or total bacteria in the hot water diffusions?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And I can't give a full answer because it is a complicated question. But I think it gets to the point that these systems are not necessarily simple, and especially in larger buildings, the system, both the hot and the cold, can be quite complex. And there's circulation of hot water is an important consideration. So I guess to give an answer, that's part of our recommendation for understanding your system and understanding the complexity, especially as built, because it might differ quite a bit from how it was originally designed. It also brings up another point in that with recirculation, it's difficult to ever really fully purge all of the hot water. So it's not like the cold water where you can purge the service line and then pull cold water to the rest of the system. The hot water could have a large capacity and is constantly circulating and mixing, so you never really know. And so that brings up how it's important to have good control over the hot water production and the circulation. And I'm not sure that it can really be remedied by flushing. That's more of a design and operation of the hot water system. But certainly, those are important and interesting, complex parts of it. So I'm not sure if I gave a full answer, but my answer would be that flushing can't fix everything. And so that's why when I started the presentation, I said flushing should be part of a larger strategy, depending on the risk assessment and the specific challenges within the building.
So Cynthia and Ray, would you like to add anything to Mike's?
I was just going to add that, yeah, the temperature, of course, of that recirculation loop is also quite important. I mean, if we are maintaining the hot water loop at 45 degrees Celsius, that's right in the wheelhouse of growth of Legionella. So ideally, again, as Mike pointed out during the presentation, we've got this balance between energy use, keeping Legionella under control, scalding risk. All these things have to be taken into consideration. So like in an ideal world where energy was limitless and we didn't have to worry about greenhouse gas emissions or whatever, then we would have the hot water loop be like 70 degrees Celsius, and then we would have scalding prevention and all the residences to make sure that no one got burned severely. And so, that would be ideal case where you could keep these Legionella under control in the hot water loop. But it's probably unrealistic from a practical standpoint. And so the hot water loop situation is really challenging. I wonder if maybe on-demand water heaters at the point of use might be a preferable way to go, where we don't keep this water right in the wheelhouse of Legionella growth, but that's a whole nother ballgame. And we didn't evaluate that specifically, but it's just something I've been thinking about.
Okay, well, thank you. Okay, move on to the next questions. I think this question's for Cynthia. So, could the use of a drill to collect biofilm sample have potentially caused the addition of coppers to the bacteria, which may have inhibited the observed presence of the Legionella within the sample from the copper pipe?
Yeah. Okay. When we sample the biofilm, we sample the biofilm in the distal branch part of the pilot that were removable. So we were able to disconnect this piece of pipe, insert the drill, the tip with the sponge that and rotate that sponge at the desired speed within the pipe in clockwise and counterclockwise for a specific period of time. So there were no damage caused to the pipe except to use the sponge to remove and collect the biofilm. So I don't think that procedure introduced copper in the system.
I can also just add,
Yes.
for the biofilm, we only characterized the DNA. So we did DNA extraction with the biofilm that we collected. And this is a relatively rapid process. We collect the sample, and then we extract the DNA, and then we have the DNA in a purified extract. And so there's no growth, and so there's no inhibition. I'm not sure if copper can inhibit PCR reactions, but I don't think they would be high enough to be at the inhibitory level. And certainly we did not observe widespread inhibition during qPCR. So I don't think it would affect our observation.
Well, thank you. My another questions. This questions about the field studies. Maybe this questions for Ray. So in field studies, were the POU located proximal to the incoming cold waters and or the hot water systems? Would the complexity and the length of the piping in the premise of plumbing be a factors in varying outcomes in terms of the flushing activities?
Yeah, I think, I guess we've been kind of harping on this a little bit, and Mike mentioned earlier that it's important to really understand the building plumbing system as best as you can. I think the length of pipe or the size of the building, let's say, and where in the building you are flushing, like in this case, we flushed the shower rooms, for example, in like the campus rec centers, that's where we worked, or some other facilities on campus. Those are fairly big buildings, and so it mostly affects the time it takes for that fresh water, the water that's representative of the main conditions from the city water supply, to get to the shower. So we would flush until we hit those conditions, and then up to, in some cases, 45 minutes just to look at an extended flushing time. So we weren't advocating or recommending 45 minutes necessarily, but we were just basically flushing for an extended time to look at how water quality changes over an extended time. But typically, even in these larger buildings, we were at or near the building inlet conditions within 6 minutes of flushing, possibly sooner, but the first sample we took was in 6 minutes. And typically within 10 or 15 minutes, we were in all cases at the building inlet concentration. So I would say the main issue is probably affecting how long it takes to get to the building inlet quality at these various locations. But that's the main issue, I believe.
Well, thank you. Well, and it looks like we're nearing the end of the webcast. So I think I'm going to ask one final questions to all three presenters. So interesting questions from the audience. So what do you feel were unexpected findings? Any unexpected findings from your study?
I can start because for me, the most unexpected was how dramatic the effect of what was really a small or meager contact time of chloramine had on Legionella, but it did not seem to affect total biomass. And so the fact that you could hit the system with chloramine, it would go away really quickly within hours, but you'd see the effect of it for weeks after was unexpected to me, and surprising.
I would say for me, if I can go next, sorry, Cynthia, the big surprise was that we had gotten funding partly from our Minnesota Department of Health to do this study during the pandemic in closed buildings here at the University of Minnesota. And I was like going in thinking that we would find, crazy concentrations of Legionella pneumophila everywhere, because the buildings had been closed for several weeks to several months. And yet they were completely devoid of Legionella pneumophila, both via culture-based and PCR-based testing. And that was completely surprising to me. We did find in a couple cases some Mycobacterium avium complex, which I didn't show. Those data are in the paper if you're interested, but nothing that was at a concentration that was at an acute health risk.
And I take the last word. I will echo what Michael highlighted, the influence of chloramine, but also we were able to demonstrate in this project the growth of total bacteria monitored currently in drinking water system was very different than the growth of Legionella species. And it's important to measure Legionella if we want to monitor this problem.
Okay. Well, thank you to our speakers and to all of you for joining us today. And we hope you found this webcast informative. And again, if you'd like to access final report, and please visit the Research Foundation website. And once again, thank you for your participations, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon. And then have a great day, and then have a great Memorial Day holiday. Thank you, everyone.